Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and what I wanted to do today was really talk about combat in 3.10 overall, but specifically also about a change that's going to really kind of disrupt combat more than really anything that we've seen in a while, and probably anything that's going to come in, at least until armor makes its appearance in the game. Now, before I dive in, I do want to apologize for the lack of content over the last few weeks, but I have been moving into a new house, and if you hear some echo, it's because I am yet again in an unfinished basement and have some construction for my office ahead of me again. So I'm trying to do my best to limit some of the echo, but it's going to be a little bit kind of tricky until we get there. Now, regarding combat, the flight model has changed significantly in 3.10. Ships now feel a lot heavier, and that means every move that you make is actually going to inherit more of the inertia that you had. So you basically drift a lot more than you did in patches before, and that's going to be more the heavier your ship is. So from a combat perspective, that means that you're likely going to be engaging ships differently. Circle strafing is still an acceptable form of combat. However, that also means that you're going to have a harder time changing directions, and the lighter the ship or the more maneuvering thrusters you have, the better you're going to be at actually adjusting your flight. That also means that a lighter ship now should have an easier time getting into a pesky position against a heavier ship. A good example I like to give is that I flew the Freelancer Miss a lot over the last few patches, and I can combine my yaw and kind of my pitch adjustments with reverse strafe to keep enough distance between my target and I let my auto gimbals and the larger components win the day against smaller ships almost every time. Now, depending on the type of engagement, it's harder for bigger ships to be able to keep a good firing solution on the smaller ships. And that's a big change, but one that I really do feel was kind of needed for balancing to make smaller fighters more relevant. Now, outside of the space changes, you also have changes in atmospheric flight that kind of complicates things. Now, you've seen the red bar in your throttle in previous patches, and in those previous patches, the most significant issue for you when you went into the red was that your ship kind of just overheated faster. Well, in 3.10, the further you push your ship into the red, the more unreliable your ship is going to fly. The red is essentially your ship's computer saying, hey, we can't really do what you're trying to do, but you're the captain, so make the call. And that's going to manifest itself in ways like unpredictable flight behavior, such as rolling unintentionally or yawing in response to the wind, and just generally being pretty squirrely. There are ships that are more designed like planes that handle this much better because they're equipped to handle the pressures and atmospheres and the environment of atmospheric flight. Ships that are designed more like spaceships, though, are going to have harsher punishments. Now, this is another change that's going to really help ships like the Avenger, the Gladius, the Arrow. Ships that have that type of design just fly a lot better on the planet, and when you start talking about combat on planet side, that makes a big difference. Another change that comes in 3.10 is the targeting. You now have two concepts to keep in mind, being select versus lock. Now, in the prior patches, you could just target immediately and be ready to engage right off the bat. It didn't matter if they were in front of you, behind you, or really anywhere, but if you targeted them, once you pointed them out, you basically had the option to really, start engaging. You would see pips and lock missiles. All those things would happen right away. Now, in 3.10, you really need to have two different keybinds. You're going to see those in the keybinding section under flight and targeting. So what you're going to have is I guess what I should say is what I've done is I've used hostiles, select target in view, and lock, unlock selected target. And what I've done with that is I have it so I have a down press on the hat switch on my joystick to select the target in view, and then I press up on the hat to actually lock them. Now, the biggest impact here is that once you're in a zone, you don't really see the triangles to let you know where the ships are. In general, in 3.9, you showed up on a battlefield and you saw targets all over your HUD. The difference now is that you really have to rely on your radar or your eyesight to see them. Now, what you do is you look at the radar, you orient your ship in the right direction, you select the one that you're facing them, using that, again, the select hostile in view, and then you push the button to actually target them, which means that you can then all of a sudden start doing things like, locking missiles. You see a pip, you can track them, it's a lot different. Now, you could probably use the option, like the cycle targets option, to find them in various positions, but if there's a lot of ships in the area, that's going to complicate things. So play with the keybinds to find what suits you. But in my mind, this is a really good change that promotes the use of radar, also promotes multiple ships that are working together, and finally making your ship harder to see via skins. Now, that's a little bit limited in its use because the ranges that we fight at makes it almost impossible to see ships anyways. It's actually a pretty fun mechanic, but it does take a little bit of getting used to. Turrets have also seen an improvement, which is exciting because so many ships rely on that ability. I don't actually know how to quantify what improved aside from the interface, but there is something there that really makes it easier to manage the battlefield and stay on target. In the Hurricane, it was pretty easy to stay on target, though there's going to be some slider-related personal preferences regarding the sensitivity that make it a little bit challenging to find your sweet spot. I would suggest probably using DPI settings on your mouse so that you can make those changes on the fly based on the type of target that you're going against, versus using the blanket in-game setting changes. It's a game changer for ships like the Hurricane or the Hammerhead, but you need to test it and get familiar with it. But man, it really is a lot more intuitive overall. The last change is the big one that I alluded to earlier. Prior to 3.10, we had auto gimbal, which meant that you can, if you ran fixed weapons, your guns shot straight forward. And gimbals meant that if you hit R twice, you had that dotted ring around the reticle, and that you were able to let your gimbals do the adjustments for you, and you had a better shot at landing your shots. That changed the game because it really meant that sacrificing the size of your gun for the gimbaled weapon really resulted in more shots landed and more DPS, even if the calculators online told you differently. That's why gimbaled Gatlings and laser repeaters were so popular, because it was the most reliable way to land a shot. The other problem that kind of plagued fixed weapons was desync. Regardless of how good your aim was, the shots didn't land reliably even if you were right on your pip. So it made more sense to let the game decide where to shoot, since the logic wasn't really working. And that's even factoring in convergence ranges. Now, for those who've played with gimbals frequently in the last few patches, you know that while sometimes you could land shots towards the edges of your dotted circle, it was unreliable and you still needed to be pretty close to the pip. That changes in 3.10. Now, gimbaled weapons are pretty reliable for the entirety of that dotted ring circle. But now, fixed weapons actually have a very limited range of gimbal, which I personally think changes everything. Now, if you're watching the video, you're going to see that there's a dotted ring for the gimbaled weapons on my ship, but there's also a smaller ring inside of that, which indicates the range of the gimbal on my fixed weapon. It's not big, and if you're fighting a way more agile ship, it's still going to be hard, but it is way better than it was before. So now you actually have a decision to make: bigger fixed or smaller gimbaled, which has always really been the story. But now that fixed actually has gimbal to some degree, it's a more complicated equation, but one that I really do think boils down to skill level, which is I think what CIG wants. If you're a good enough pilot to be able to land shots in the smaller circle, then fixed is going to be the way to go. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm the best fighter pilot out there or I'm a great combat pilot, but I'm good enough. And as someone who has really used gimbaled weapons with a lot of success and has been able to land shots because I'm able to stay on the pip, it's a compelling decision. Ships like the Freelancer that have pilot-controlled turrets are going to see not much of a choice to make, though the improved gimbal experience is going to benefit them pretty well. But ships like the Vanguard or the Prowler or the Sabre or the Hornet, that's where things get a little bit more interesting. Take the Prowler. You can either gimbal everything and you bring 2 size 3s on the turret and 2 size 4s on the wings, or you can bring 2 size 3s on the turret, because you can't really change that out, and 2 size 5s fixed. Vanguard gets a gimbaled size 4 or a fixed size 5. Sabre gets 4 size 2s gimbaled or 4 size 3s fixed. You can see what's happening. It behooves the player to get good enough with the ship that they're using to bring the larger firepower to the engagement and still have a little bit of gimbal, but only if it makes sense for their skill level and the agility of their ship. I would argue that on ships like the Prowler and the Sabre, that they have enough fine control where hitting the target's going to be easy enough, even with a small circle of focus, that it makes sense to bring the bigger fixed weapons. On ships like the Constellation, though, it's going to be sluggish and you're going to have a hard time adjusting to smaller targets, and you may end up benefiting more from the forgiving gimbal reticle, and I think that makes more sense. At the end of the day, you need to really decide how you want to fight and what you can do. I suggest you get familiar with what you prefer and max out your DPS, but it will take time and practice. So that's basically what I wanted to cover. I will say that 310 is probably the biggest disruptor to combat that we've seen to date. And as we get more time and I get more ability to test ships more, I plan to revisit some of the guides and buying options, and we'll probably boot up some of the older build videos that I used to do. But that should at least give you the basics of combat changes in 310. Now, if you have questions, please let me know in the comments. I do want to remind everyone that I have a Patreon that helps to support the channel, and in addition to the Patreons earning all of my referrals, you also get access to what may be one of the better Star Citizen Discords in the verse for Star Citizen knowledge, so look into it if you're interested. Anyways, I appreciate you all watching. I hope everyone stays safe out there, and have yourselves a wonderful day. Take care.